As you all know, as we've already mentioned this morning, this is the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And I've already said to you, and you already know, that the tagline is "We will never forget." And the truth is that this day was an absolutely significant day in the history of our country. And it was in part so significant because it took our country at its core, which was security and prosperity and blessing and invincibility, and it shook that core. It rocked that core, and the core fell apart. And all of a sudden we realized that we weren't as secure as we thought we were. And as we remember that day, I want to remind you this morning of the importance of the community that we felt following that tragic event. And I want to try to convince you this morning, if you need convincing and if that's what it takes, that making an investment in community is one of the best investments that you can make. And to do that, we will look at the book of Nehemiah. I'm always telling the kids, you should be grateful for your names. Imagine having to spell Nehemiah all the time. Nehemiah chapter 4, and we'll be looking at verses 6 all the way down to verse 20. I know it's a long passage, so just bear with me this morning. So we built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. All of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause a disturbance in it. But we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. Thus in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. Yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall. Our enemies said they will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work. When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against us from every place where you may turn. Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. From that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates, and the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load, with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. As for the builders, each wore his sword girded at his side as he built, while the trumpeters stood near me. I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. At whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Now, in order to just be able to get a better understanding of this passage this morning, I want to provide a little bit of a background story for you for Nehemiah. Nehemiah and Ezra, which is the book that's right next to it, can be seen together as a unit. In fact, these two men shine as examples of people in community. And if we had the whole weekend to talk about community, I would lead you through both of these men's lives, because that's what we have here. We have two men working together toward a common goal to achieve that goal. Ezra and Nehemiah were co-workers. Ezra was the scholar. He was the teacher of the scriptures. Nehemiah was the one who was working with stone and with mortar. And they show us that neither job was more or less important than the other, and neither job was more or less holy than the other. They were both needed. They needed each other, and we still do. Nehemiah, which is where our focus is this morning, was a government worker. He was working in Susa around 430 BC. This is after the people of Judah had returned to Jerusalem. They were coming back from the exile in Babylonia. And Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king there, who obviously was a foreign king. Now, Nehemiah heard reports of the city of Jerusalem as the people had started to go back there. He heard reports that the city was in really bad shape. The wall had crumbled, it was in rubble, the gates had been burned, the city had basically been destroyed. And this depresses him because it's his hometown, right? If you saw your hometown destroyed, you'd be a little depressed too. So Nehemiah's not looking so great when he's in front of the king, and the king asks him what's wrong. And he decides to be really bold and to tell the king what's bothering him, and he says, well, my hometown is a mess. It's a wreck. And the king says, well, what do you want to do about it? And Nehemiah says, I want to go fix it. I want to go fix my city. I want to go fix the wall. And the king shows great favor. A foreign king allows him to go back and to rebuild the walls of his city. Now, the king gives him such unbelievable favor that it could only be from God. Because not only does he allow him to go back to his city to do the work, he also authorizes his travel, which was kind of an important thing then. If you were going to travel, you needed the permission of the king. Not only does he do that, he gives him timbers from the surrounding woods. And he tells him he can use the timbers to repair the gates, to build a little house for himself while he's doing the work. Wasn't that nice? And the king even goes one step farther, and he gives him an escort to get him there. It was truly God's favor. Now, of course, what happens? The enemy gets upset, right? And we've got these guys here, Sanballat and Tobiah, and they're a little angry. Now, Nehemiah goes to the city. He sees that it's a complete wreck. He calls the Jewish people together and he says, come on, we can do this. We can fix this. We can repair what's been destroyed. And they go for it. The cupbearer now becomes a contractor. Some of us realize that our lives change over the course of time, and our professions sometimes have to change over the course of time. And in the chapter that follows, you can read about an entire community of people who come together and they work together to rebuild what had been destroyed. We get to chapter 4 of Nehemiah, which is where we read this morning. And you remember the enemy, Sanballat, was exploding in anger over the rebuilding project, okay? And Nehemiah does what he does best. He prays and he gets back to work. And that was where we picked up today. I want you to look at this passage in the context of building community and making an investment in community. And the first question that you might be asking yourself is, well, why? Why should we invest in community? Well, the first thing that I think that we see here is that community, particularly the church community, is a place where we can learn to sharpen our faith by putting it into action. Remember in verse 6, we read that the whole wall had actually been built to half its height, half as tall as it was supposed to be. And it says that the people had a mind to work. That's a really emphatic statement. I look at people today, and Herb would tell you I can look at my own life, and question sometimes my mind to work. We as a culture have generally gotten a little bit more lazy, I think, over the years. I do. We don't have the work ethic of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. We just don't have that work ethic anymore. But Nehemiah's people, they had a mind, a heart, actually, to work. And they were engaged in the work that they were doing. How many of you know that if you are engaged in God's work, God will bless you in that? It will go well for you. Now, the enemy also gets upset when you work here in our lives, and obviously in this passage. He wants to make attempts to stop the work, to thwart the work that's going on, and that's what happened here. And so the people, the community of God's people working together to do something, they pray to God, and then they set up a guard. Do you see what's happening here? It's a beautiful combination of faith and action. Their faith is being exercised because they're going to God in prayer. They're seeking Him, His strength, His power, His wisdom, His direction. But they don't then just sit back and say, okay, well, we prayed. Now God should just show up and fix everything for us, and he'll send the enemy on out of here, and it'll all be good. No, they started back up for the work. They got back to it. Scripture teaches us all over that our faith is to be lived out through our actions. That's how we demonstrate our faith. And we pray because everything we do depends on God. We can't do anything in our own power, in our own strength. It all depends on him. But then we work because labor is a holy thing. Do you remember Adam back in the garden? He wasn't just sitting around enjoying the pretty trees and bushes and not having to do anything. Adam worked. Work is holy. When you work and you do it unto the Lord, he blesses that. So the people prayed and they worked. They used the resources that he gave them. What were their resources? Each other. That was how the work got accomplished. And one of the best ways to sharpen our faith is by putting it into action within a community. Now, in a church community, that looks like ministry projects, it looks like service projects, it looks like helping out in a classroom on a Sunday morning, or helping out with the coffee on a Sunday morning, or setting up chairs. Those are all ways that we can put our faith into action. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to accomplish things on our own, isn't it? If Herb and I alone had to come in here on a Sunday morning and get all of this ready for you, well, it might work, but we'd be really tired. and we need each other. We need each other. We aren't meant to go this alone. And I saw that last night. I saw such a tangible example of that last night. We were at Megan's wedding. Megan Dom got married yesterday. She's no longer Megan Dom. So, and they used one of our projection screens, and they had to have it torn down in between showing the video and the dancing portion of the reception. And Herb went over with Scott, and they started taking it down, and immediately Randy and Maury jumped up because they knew how that screen came down, and they went to work. It was practice for this morning. We can't do things on our own. We need a community of people around us, and when we have a heart to work and we come together, imagine the things that God could accomplish. Imagine what he could do through us by his power and us working together. Now, just a side note here. We are so often afraid of failure. That's why we don't do anything. That's why we've gotten lazy, because we're afraid of failure. The church community is a safe place for you to learn to fail, and for you to make mistakes, and for you to fall down, and for you to be surrounded by a community of people who will help you to get up and brush yourself off and get back to it. Do you remember in the New Testament when Paul talks about working out your own salvation with fear and trembling? That's about learning how to do this whole faith journey, this spiritual walk with fear. That means just in awe and reverence of God and who he is, surrounded by a group of people, a community of people who love you and who will support you and who will come alongside you. There is safety in learning to live out our faith in the context of community. Now, learning to live out our faith in a church community hopefully then means that you will go out with boldness into the other communities that you're a part of. Maybe parents of friends of your kids. The kids can go into their schools. That's a community that they're a part of every day. Live out your faith. I really want you to see then what happens in this passage, because I think it provides for us perhaps the strongest reason to invest in community. The people are rebuilding the walls. They're praying, they're working, they're dealing with threats from the enemy, they're trying to guard against those threats. And in verse 10, the strength of the burden bearers begins to fail.